Good evening and welcome to our Waltham Public Library program, An American Horror Story, The History of Racial Terror Lynchings, with Dr. Brenna Greer of Wellesley College. This is part of our series, A Year of Black History. My name is Deborah Hoffman and I organize programs and events for the library. Thanks for tuning in. Before we start, I want to let you know how the evening will go. Our speaker will do a 35 to 45-minute presentation, and then she'll field questions. To ask questions via the chat function, use a Google account to sign into YouTube. And feel free to write your questions at any time, and then I'll read them during the Q&A. Dr. Brenna Greer is an associate professor of history at Wellesley College. She's a historian of race, gender, and culture in the 20th century United States, who explores historical connections between capitalism, social movements, and visual culture. Her first book, Represented: The Black Image Makers Who Reimagined African American Citizenship, examines the historical circumstances that made the media representation of Black citizenship good business in the post-World War II era. She is currently at work on her second book, which examines the post-war development of Black commercial publishing and its significance within US culture and Black life. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Professor Greer.
Thank you. And can you hear me okay now?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen then. All set?
Great.
Great. Good evening, everyone. I really do appreciate being with you tonight. And I want to take a second just to thank Waltham Public Library, and especially Deborah, for giving me an opportunity to speak with you tonight as part of this series. As someone who's usually only ever asked to speak during Black History Month, I appreciate a series that recognizes Black history an entire year, devotes an entire year to different topics in Black history. And I want to thank all of you who are part of the audience this evening, particularly because this is a uniquely difficult topic covered by this talk. Again, racial terror lynching in US history. And you know, when Deborah approached me about speaking in this series, she gave me a list of topics that I could choose from. And I actually chose lynching as my topic. And in the last week, I've been asking myself why. It's not the easiest topic, but there were reasons that I wanted to speak to this. One, this was the first time someone had given me an opportunity to talk about lynching outside of the classroom. And so I really didn't want to pass that up, because I do believe that lynching and the history of lynching deserves, but also requires, a broader audience. And then the second motivating factor for me, which is related to the first, is that this is an opportunity, or I see it as an opportunity for me to use my expertise as a US and African-American, or a historian of US and African-American history, to provide context for what I see as racial terrorism in our current moment. And so that's in the form of, increased demonstrations of white supremacists or hate groups, a growing number of physical and verbal assaults towards Asians and Asian Americans, and then also a continued violence against Black and Brown people, and often at the hands of law enforcement. And so all of those horrific trends, I very much believe, have roots in this country's history of race and racism, obviously, but also lynching is very central to that history. So I really want to tie that in to a larger story. And so I have a broad plan for my talk, which is that I'm just going to go over some basic information that I think will be useful to setting up a longer discussion about the history. I'm going to talk about the origins of lynching as a form of racial terror, particularly as related to African Americans. And then I want to talk about how lynching figured into other cultural trends in US history. And then finally, I will make a comment on what I see the relevance of this history of racial terrorism to our current moment. And so it probably goes without saying that a talk on lynching is going to be difficult and even disturbing at moments, but I do want to warn you that you might hear, but also see things that are upsetting to you. So I would tell you what I tell my students, do what you need to do. To be honest, I'd be concerned if this wasn't upsetting. It's upsetting to me. So, and then one more thing is that I want to reiterate that this will be available on the YouTube channel, on the library's YouTube channel. So to the extent that you can just free yourself up to listen without worrying about, oh, am I getting this information? I think that's always useful when trying to take in history. So with that, the first thing that needs to happen is we need to define what is lynching. And I think this is a necessary starting point because this definition has actually been a matter of serious debate historically, because depending on how lynching is defined bears on how lynchings have been identified and tabulated. And so as you can imagine, this has significance to people who are trying to illuminate racial terror, but also to those who want to deny it, right? And so to be clear, the definition of lynching is an extra legal, as in outside of the law, with no due process, an extra legal killing by a mob, typically by hanging, for an alleged offense. And so here a mob means 3 or more people. And I think that might be surprising to some, right? And so contrary to popular belief as well, lynchings typically take the form of hanging, but hanging is not a necessary component of lynching. And I think understanding this is significant when it comes to general understanding of both the nature and the degree of racial terror targeted towards particular groups at different times in our nation's history. And so historically, there have been 2 organizations that have really tracked lynchings in the United States. And those are the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, and the Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University. And the NAACP was and continues to be an interracial civil rights organization that was founded in 1909. And then the Tuskegee Institute has been and now is the main repository for lynching data in the nation. And thanks to these 2 institutions, we have rough information about the occurrence, the prevalence of lynching in our nation's history. So, and we have long known now that from about the mid-19th through the mid-20th century, there have been between 4,000 to 5,000 recorded lynchings in the United States. And in recent years, actually, the Equal Justice Initiative has researched only southern states, and their research suggests that the numbers might be higher than we have thought they are. And so given this data, we can discern 2 main things about the history of lynching in this country. One is that contrary to the prevailing narrative, lynching actually isn't just a black and white story. You see here numbers that tell you that, African Americans are largely the target, but they've not been the only victims. And while I'm going to speak more to African Americans, I do want to take a moment to talk about the fact that while a distant second, people of Mexican descent account for a sizable number of lynching victims in our nation's history. Beginning in the 1840s, Mexican and Mexican Americans were seen as competition in gold rush camps along the border. And historians think that at least 550 to 600 people of Mexican descent were lynched. But again, those numbers are kind of obscured because people taking the numbers have dealt in black and white. So some of those victims might have been counted as black. Also, there are Chinese immigrants were actually quite vulnerable to lynching, not to the same degree as people of Mexican descent, but in 1871, actually, one of the worst mass lynchings in U.S. history occurred in Los Angeles when a riot resulted in a lynch mob going into a neighborhood where Chinese immigrants lived, and that mob then lynched 15 Chinese immigrants, including one 15-year-old boy. So my point here is just to stress that, again, while African Americans are not the only target, or that African Americans are not the only target of racial terror lynching. But if we do go back to the numbers, Blacks have been the overwhelming target in this nation's history, which has everything to do with slavery, and actually more accurately with the abolition of slavery. It's no coincidence that any map of lynching that you look at, you're going to see that the history of lynching is largely a Southern story. And so to explain why, I'm going to take us to focus on the post-Civil War era for a moment and in the Southern United States. Because when the Confederacy surrendered in 1865, as I'm sure some of you know, we entered a period of Reconstruction. And this is a period where the federal government controlled and also occupied those states that had seceded from the Union. Reconstruction is also the federal government abolished slavery. And then they also determined and protected the rights of freed men. And this is a new social class of millions of formerly enslaved Blacks. So during this period is when these three very important amendments are passed. The 13th, which abolishes slavery, the 14th, which grants citizenship to people of African descent, and then the 15th, which grants Black men the right to vote. But despite these measures, and perhaps not surprisingly, many formerly enslaved people, most of whom did not have any resources, they had little power, broken families, and nowhere to go, a lot of formerly enslaved people remained in a state of precarious and even negligible freedom. But Reconstruction legislation, combined with the support of the Freedmen's Bureau and then also the protection of federal troops, did allow for some progress. And that was especially in the form of political participation or political representation. And so a way of looking at that is to consider that by 1872, so just 7 years after slavery's end, more than 1,500 African-American men held political office at a state or a local level. And then by 1875, 16 Black men were elected to Congress or had been elected to Congress, including actually 2 Black senators. And just for some perspective, to date, there have been a total of 11 Black senators, 2 of which were elected in the decade immediately following slavery, and 3 of whom are serving right now, right? So that's a pretty remarkable progress and what Reconstruction allowed for. And as you can probably imagine, white Southerners or white supremacists were not happy about this turn of events, most especially the white Southern Democrat elite or the former slaveholding class. Because as a slave society was rooted in white supremacy, and Reconstruction profoundly upset that racial and social order. And so immediately upon the end of the Civil War, the former slaveholding class goes to work to try and set things right, as it were. And that begins in 1865, again, immediately with Southern states, cities, and towns passing what are known as Black codes, which were laws that restricted African Americans' rights along many lines. And then the formation of several white terrorist groups. I think most of us are familiar with the Ku Klux Klan. And the main objective of these groups was to prevent African Americans from exercising their freedom. And then around 1870, and largely in response to African American men getting the vote, Southern whites formed a political coalition which became known as the Redeemers. And the goal was to redeem the South, right? And their goal was to regain their political power, which necessarily meant obstructing that of African Americans, and particularly by preventing them from voting. And all of these measures really speak to what one of my former professors wrote in his book about a prominent redeemer. He wrote in the introduction, it's a perfect thesis sentence and topic sentence. He wrote, "White supremacy was hard work. I would argue that it is hard work because it must continually be asserted and reasserted precisely because it's a false premise, right? So the restraints of Reconstruction did act as a check on these white supremacist forces, which is not to say, however, that these forces were suppressed, only hindered. But then in 1877, a contested presidential election in 1876 resulted in a deal in which the Democrats allowed the Republican candidate to assume the office or assume the presidency in exchange for a withdrawal of federal troops from the South. And it's not too much of an exaggeration to say, just like that, Reconstruction was over, and with it, any and all of the protections it offered freedmen. And so it's at this point that lynching rises as a form of racial terror towards African Americans. And by the 1890s, lynching was a common practice used by white supremacists for the purposes of terrorizing, policing, and also eliminating African Americans. And during the 1890s, 150 African Americans were lynched each year of that decade. And so among those numbers, it was the vast majority were Black men and boys, which is due in part to the role that white womanhood has played as a motivation, but also defense for racial terror lynchings, at least against African Americans. And so in the 1870s, as part of forming a political coalition, the Redeemers cultivated what some historians refer to as the rape myth. And it cast Black men as sexual predators, which in turn made white men the protectors of white women, the white women that the Black men sought to violate, right? And the utility of this myth was that it inspired fear among whites that then encouraged poor Southern whites to go against their own economic and political interests and instead join with the former slaveholding class in the interest of protecting white women, but also I would say white supremacy, right? And with the rape myth in place, accusations of rape inspired, but then also acquitted lynch mobs because lynchings were considered a justifiable form of punishment for rape or any advance by a Black man towards white women, and even a necessary measure to send a message to other Black men to stay away from white women. And typically there was little evidence that the Black man who was lynched had actually committed rape, but that hardly mattered. And so students often ask me when I'm telling them about lynching rising in the post-Civil War period, they often ask me, why did whites not use lynching during slavery? And certainly there were incidents of lynching during slavery, but there's two primary reasons. First, lynching wasn't a logical form of control or policing in the context of slavery, at least not as a common practice, because enslaved people were property, right? And so to kill them is to lose property, to actually deprive yourself of a financial asset, as well as the slave labor that's provided. But the second reason, or I should say the second reason, goes to the heart of what lynching was in the post-emancipation South. And that was a form of racial terror, right? And the purpose of it was to oppress Blacks who, no longer enslaved, might exercise their rights as citizens, right? So in other words, lynching was not about killing Black people, right? Of course it was. But its primary purpose was to exercise and to assert white supremacy and keep Blacks in their place, as it were, right? The purpose was terrorism. So that's why a key element of racial terror lynchings is actually that they are public displays of white power that happen out in the open, and they often involve torture, and often prolonged torture. And we know this because there are many photographs, and I'm actually going to go through a series of photographs right now. And so I just want you to have that, that warning. So we know about the public display or the publicness of racial terror lynchings because there's ample evidence. right? These are all happening in public with crowds, with numerous people present, mostly men in these photographs. And this here is actually a picture of a lynching in 1919 in Omaha, Nebraska, following World War I, when there was Red Summer, when there was a lot of rioting in cities, and African Americans were largely the targets. So lynchings were not only public affairs, they were often community affairs, right? And you can see that here and here. And they were even family affairs, right? That involved and likely indoctrinated children, right? So for obvious reasons, Blacks were rarely among these crowds, but that didn't diminish the effect that lynchings had as a tool of terrorizing and policing them. Because for one, lynch mobs often left the bodies of lynch victims on display as a visible warning, but also news of lynching circulated widely by mouth and then through photographs like these. And I should say that as much as I hate these photographs, I do appreciate how they show that the people who are doing lynching, they're not evil monsters with horns, right? They're not aberrant. They're just people who were operating within a particular context in accordance with particular ruling ideas, right? And my purpose here is not to absolve them. My purpose is to stress the degree to which racial terror can and often has become normal, right? And a group activity. And so these images also, in terms of talking about culture and the relationship to culture, they also show the centrality of photography to the practice and culture of racial terror lynchings. A quick Google search, which I do not recommend at all, indicates how numerous lynching photographs were and are, and that these photographs exist tells us that white lynch mobs operated with impunity, and they wanted visual proof of that, right? And it's that desire actually that led to the advent of lynching postcards, right? And so these were souvenirs that grew out of lynchings. And the postcards were souvenirs along with people often tried to get a piece of the hanging rope. And most horribly, they would try to get body parts from the lynching victim. And so that a trade in souvenirs grows up out of these events documents how racial terror lynchings became a site and a source of consumerism, right? These postcards, for example, became a consumer product that circulated beyond the event of the lynching, right? And then in addition to consumer goods, consumer services actually developed around lynching. So by the early 20th century, racial terror lynchings have become a reason to gather, right? They've become a site of leisure and festivity. And so as a form of racial terror, the lynching of Black people peaked in the 1890s. But by the 1920s, you see those numbers drop precipitously. And that's largely because millions of African Americans got out of the South. One, they were seeking jobs, which became available with World War I. But more to the point, they were seeking refuge. They were seeking safety, right? But as this graph also indicates, there were small spikes during and after World War I and then after World War II. And the victims in these cases were primarily Black soldiers or veterans, right, who white men in particular viewed as threats to white supremacy, and I'm thinking white masculinity. And so you had in 1917, a Mississippi senator saying that if a Black soldier got a sense of himself as a hero, it was, quote, but a short step to the conclusion that his political rights must be respected, which he then warned would, quote, inevitably lead to disaster. Now, I want it to be clear, not to just make this like a white power story. I want it to be clear that throughout this entire period, beginning in the 1880s, African Americans are organizing against lynching. And Black women were often were an essential force within the anti-lynching movement, beginning most notably with Ida B. Wells, who started tracking and reporting lynching as a journalist. She started tracking and reporting on lynchings in the 1880s, and then produced in 1895 a Red Record, which was kind of a compilation of her findings. And for those actions, she was actually run out of Memphis. Her press was burned. She was run out of Memphis, and she had to escape to the north. And then in the 1920s, the Anti-Lynching Crusaders, which was a Black women's group, organized African Americans to protest lynching through fundraising, through actual marching. And then during the same period, the NAACP, which was newly formed in 1909, like I said, rose to be the most prominent anti-lynching force. And then throughout the first half of the 20th century, roughly, this organization routinely protested in the streets, again, maybe in New York, their headquarters, but also chapters around the nation. And then they also lobbied Congress and presidents to pass anti-lynching legislation. Two significant anti-lynching bills were put to Congress in 1918 and then 1934. And these would make lynching a federal crime. That was the significance of this legislation. And then the NAACP also dedicated itself to publicizing the shame of America, as they called it. And they did that through their magazine, The Crisis, which you see here. And then also through publications and pamphlets that they put out. And then even in 1935, they organized an art exhibit dedicated to the topic of lynching to raise awareness among particularly elite groups. And so what I really find interesting here, I want to draw your attention to, in protesting and publicizing lynching, the NAACP relied on or co-opted the same photographs that whites had used or were using to document their power. So despite the best efforts of anti-lynching activists, Congress failed to or refused to pass anti-lynching legislation in 1918 or 1934, and racial terror lynchings continued without many Americans giving much thought to the matter. And that was until 1955 in the lynching of Emmett Till. Now, I'm sure, or I imagine that many of you out there know that Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy from Chicago who, in the summer of 1955, went down to Mississippi to visit relatives. And while out with his cousins one day, he made the fatal, literally, mistake of teasing a white woman, Carolyn Bryant. And that resulted in Carolyn's husband, Roy Bryant, and Roy Bryant's half-brother, J.W. Millam, and another yet unidentified third man kidnapping Till from his relative's home, torturing him, lynching him, and then dumping him in the Tallahatchie River. And his body was discovered then 3 days later with a cotton gin tied around his neck with barbed wire. And so when his body was discovered, his mother, Mamie Till Bradley, insisted that his body be sent home, which was actually one, fairly courageous of her and actually very hard for her to accomplish. But she insisted that his body was sent home to Chicago, and the picture where she's dropping in sorrow is her meeting his body at the train station in Chicago. So she succeeded in that objective. And then when the body arrived at the Southside Chicago funeral home where she had the body prepared, she allowed photographers or a photographer to take pictures of her son's mutilated body, determining that, as she put it, I want the world to see what they did to my boy. And so in doing so, she also flipped the script and adopted photography to her purposes of documenting the violence that was done to her son. And she determined where that evidence, which channels it would flow through. In addition to allowing the photographs of her son, she also insisted on an open casket funeral. right? And then after the funeral, she allowed her son's body to lay in state, as it were, at the funeral home for 3 days so that the public could come and view it. And they did. Thousands came to view the corpse of Emmett Till. And then shortly thereafter, the Black News Digest, Jet magazine published a photo essay about the lynching that actually included the photographs that Bradley allowed to be taken. And so this is the first, it's a 4-page photo essay, and this is the first 2 pages of the essay. And this actually is the cover that was on that issue of Jet. So you'd have no idea, unless you were waiting for it, that this content was going to be inside, right? And I'm now going to show you the photographs that were included, and I am actually going to show you them. They are not blotted out here. So these are the photographs that actually appeared in that issue of Jet. And so between Bradley's actions and then Jet's coverage, Till's lynching became what one civil rights activist has called, quote, the best advertised lynching in US history. And it's interesting to think about that, because you have photography and you have African Americans consuming those photographs, which is a complete flip of the tradition of white people taking photographs of these racial terror lynchings and then trading in them. Right. And so many civil rights activists and many African Americans, including my father, have pointed to the moment of seeing these photographs and having a political awakening. And a lot of people, including historians, identify or commonly identify Emmett Till's lynching and then its publicizing through the media as an event that galvanized and perhaps even prompted or compelled the modern civil rights movement. And so it was the first and last racial terror lynching in the United States to receive that extent of national and global coverage. And so with that history, I want to talk about why it matters, why this isn't just a gray box in the textbook discussion, and why this should be considered a central part of our history, but also the world that we live in now. And so for one, while the lynching of Emmett Till may mark the beginning of the civil rights movement, it does not mark the end of lynching in the United States. And at this very moment, activists and lawyers are investigating 8 suspected racial terror lynchings of African-American men, all of which occurred in the 21st century, all of which have occurred in the last 20 years. And we should also consider that it was only last year that the House of Representatives passed anti-lynching legislation, only then to have that held up in the Senate by Rand Paul. So this legislation hasn't been passed by Congress yet, right? And that's 140 years after the rise of racial terror lynchings against African Americans. The other thing that I really want to draw attention to is that for racial terror lynchings to have occurred on the scale that they have in our nation's history, officials of the state were complicit, right? Governors, presidents, sheriffs, police, they often either turned a blind eye or endorsed these activities. And in some cases, they participated. And that shouldn't be so surprising, at least not in the South, because it was very common for members of law enforcement in the South to also be members of white supremacist groups like the KKK or white citizens councils more in a Jim Crow mid-19th or mid-20th century era. Now, it would be irresponsible if I didn't say that in many cases, lynch mobs overpowered local sheriffs or police to get to the object of their fury. But it's also true that local officials often turned Black men and women over to lynch mobs. And then we also have to consider that despite operating in plain sight, members of lynch mobs were almost never prosecuted. One figure has 99% or has 99% of lynchings have gone unprosecuted, right, with no conviction for those racial terror lynchings. So this is to say that lynchings fit in a long history of law enforcement's relationship, at least, to racial terror towards Black and Brown people, and especially Black and Brown men. And few people understand that policing in this nation is rooted in slave patrols that were organized to surveil, to pursue, to apprehend, and to punish enslaved Blacks. And then those took the form of militia-like forces after the Civil War, right? And then combine that with the fact that for much of this nation's history, African Americans were largely prevented from serving on police forces, from holding office, from voting, from sitting on juries, or testifying against white people. And so as a result, I believe it is not an exaggeration to say that white supremacy and Black criminalization are baked into this nation's justice system. And understanding that is necessary to understanding how and why racial violence, racial terror figures into modern day policing and allows for the scenes that I'm showing you now, or is at least context for the scenes that I'm showing you now. And then the last point that I want to make is that racial terror lynchings demonstrated, but they have also contributed to a culture that disregards, denigrates, and ultimately destroys Black bodies. And so you may have wondered why I obscured the Black bodies in the photographs I shared today. And it wasn't to save you the pain of looking at them, right? For the historian, lynching photographs carry significant value as evidence, as primary sources, right? And they can inform a broader audience about the history and the horror of racial terror or racial terrorism in this nation's history. But as someone who works on visual culture, I believe that images do work. And images of degraded, defiled Black bodies visually work to devalue those bodies, to define them as less than. And so as a teacher, I only ever share the lynching photographs of Emmett Till because his mother wanted it so. But I would really ask that all of us consider or reconsider how we deal in images of Black pain and Black death, which are so readily available thanks to a world of Google and social media, but also to our nation's history of racial terrorism. Thank you. Let me stop sharing here. Oops. I do have recommended sources here. Should I don't know, I can leave them up or I can share it in a different way at a different point, or they'll be on the screen for someone to see in the YouTube video later. Okay. All right.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Greer, for sharing with us the history of this really important and extremely painful topic. I do have some questions for you. I think our audience may take some time to come up with those questions. But one question I have is, can you talk about how local news outlets handled lynchings in their own communities? Since they were such community affairs, did the local press cover them, and how did they do so?
Yeah, it really varied from location to location, and newspapers often covered them. Sometimes they advertised them. Sometimes advertisements were placed in newspapers for lynching events. You certainly have editorials by Southern newspapers opposing lynching, right, as a stain on that city or that town. Interestingly, though, each time a civil rights organization or activist would bring a spotlight to a lynching in a Southern town, very often the press then rallied around that town and really cast that civil rights organization or activist as being a troublemaker. And this is where a lot of the debate about what a lynching constitutes came in, because often you had the NAACP in the instance of Emmett Till really, insisting that this was a lynching. It was a mob extra legal killing of someone for an alleged offense, right? And so you definitely see that there are people who are anti-lynching in the South, and then they're in positions, editorial positions at newspapers, but there's often, that does not mean that those papers were not covering those lynchings. And sometimes they were really condemning them, but they definitely covered them. And if there were photographs, they ran the photographs. Right. And so in the North, you have a lot of commentary on lynchings, not as much photography, not as many photographs, particularly in the earlier 1920s or 1900s, when there wasn't the same type of photo services and news services that there are now, or that there were by the mid-20th century.
And was the coverage, was it full coverage? Like, was there anything that talked about the families of the victim or the impact on the victim's community? Or
no, not at all. In fact, there's an effort right now, and it's not the Equal Justice Initiative, although this is some of what they're doing. There's an effort now to go back and get that information, to put that information with the death record, right? To put that information with the criminal records or the news stories. Often they said the offense, they talked in detail about what was done to people who were lynched, which again was not necessarily hanging, and often not just hanging. And then they would talk about who was involved or not, right? It depended on whether or not there was a seemingly justifiable offense, right? And oftentimes it was just an anonymous, totally visible, out in the daylight mob of people, and there weren't people who were identified.
Can you talk a little bit about how Black community leaders spoke to their communities after a lynching occurred?
Yeah, I can a little. Oftentimes, Black communities, Black leaders, either in churches, would address these matters. They would do it in churches, they would do it in a much less activist way. It was often Black women's clubs and local chapters of, say, the NAACP or the Urban League that would really talk about the practical things that need to happen to be able to fight lynching, such as, writing your representatives, raising money, lobbying for anti-lynching legislation. But what's interesting, and I'm sure it wasn't up on screen long enough, one of the things that the NAACP did was they really stressed the harm done on white children from lynchings, right? They took us, which I saw as a, not insincere or disingenuous, but very strategic, right? About what it was doing to the psyche of white children who were present, which was often the case at certainly these more like festival or community lynchings. And so oftentimes the messages were wrapped in a call for action, and then an attempt to reassure people of their worth, depending on who where the message was coming through. And that was certainly the case in churches.
Can you talk a little bit about the impact of lynchings in the Black communities?
Terror, right? I mean, like really terror, a lot of things that, you might imagine in terms of behavior, in terms of trying to assert your rights or just your dignity in any little moment, right? There's, Black people had to get off the sidewalk when white people walked by in the Jim Crow South. Often they lost their property just because somebody came and claimed it, right? And they gave it up because they understood that racial terror, killing was very much a possibility if they resisted in any way. So, for those communities, and particularly in the South and not exclusively in the South, but in the South, racial terror lynchings did what they were supposed to do. They put the Black community on notice. Again, racial terror lynchings did not just happen in the South, but as those maps showed, they were a function of Jim Crow, a function of white supremacy, and a function very much about disenfranchising African Americans. Tied to this is really an attempt to keep African Americans from voting. There's a fear, there's just hatred and racism, and then also a belief in white supremacy, but there's some real practical purposes to racial terrorism. And one of them was making sure that African Americans in the South did not exercise or could not exercise their right as citizens to vote, and therefore then be able to affect the social order and political order.
I read that lynchings were often held on courthouse lawns.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's interesting to think about, I'm in Wellesley, and Wellesley doesn't actually have a town square, but we have all of these commons in these New England towns. But a courthouse would have been the equivalent of a common area in a lot of Southern towns. But it was also the case that African Americans, men and women and teenagers who were accused of a crime were being held in jails that were often in courthouses. And so mobs would go to the courthouses, drag them out of the courthouses, drag them out of the jail, and then the lynching would occur, spontaneously there in that site. So partly it was a site of community, where people gathered, but then also it was a site of convenience.
Let's see. This is a question from an audience member.
Yeah, sure.
Maya Angelou wrote of being a whorehouse madam, a commie, and a lesbian. I'm actually not gonna, it's not actually a question. Not actually a question. So I'm gonna pass on that one. You mentioned that there were some cases in the 21st century.
Yes. Yeah.
You said, I think within the past 10 years or 20 years?
Yeah, there have been incidents of African-American men and teenagers being found hanging from trees. In many of those cases, local authorities have ruled them a suicide, but other evidence surrounding the site, as well as in terms of what family and friends know, suggest otherwise. And so this is, as I said in my talk, suspected lynchings. Even so, the last lynching that is accepted is accepted knowledge. It was 1981, but then I think it was, I can't remember what year it was, when, I'm forgetting his first name, I want to say Daniel Byrd in Texas was actually taken by 3 white men and tied to their truck and driven around. That is a lynching. And that happened in this century. So this is, and my fear is right now, given a lot of kind of cover that's been being given to, I think, a growth, or at least a organizing around white supremacist ideas, right? As I said before, it's important not to think of people who participated in lynch mobs as anything other than people, right? And so that means that that type of racial terrorism is very much a possibility now. And we're seeing it. We're seeing it much more right now, visibly in relationship to Asian and Asian Americans, right? Not lynchings, but racial terrorism and racial attacks, right? And then again, I would argue that you see the influence of that in African Americans' relationship to law enforcement and how African Americans are treated by law enforcement compared to other groups.
Okay, thank you. Okay, people are writing comments, but no questions.
That's not surprising to me. This is a hard one.
Yes. And I'm also trying to keep an eye on the clock. It looks like we don't have any more questions. So I think it's okay to end this live stream. And I want to thank you all for tuning in. And thank you again, Professor Greer, for such an excellent presentation.
Absolutely.
And good night, everyone.
Night.